Kia ora, Murray here. There's nothing specifically triggering in this episode, especially compared to what you heard in previous episodes. We did want to let you know that we asked for an interview with a church representative, but they declined. We put all allegations in this series against the LDS Church to them in writing, and they responded, "As followers of Jesus Christ, members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints abhor abuse of any kind. As a church, we invest heavily on prevention and response and will continue to do so. When a lay leader of one of our congregations learns of abuse, they are asked to immediately call a helpline to assist them to protect the victim and to ensure that perpetrators face the consequences of their actions. The church claims that the helpline ensures compliance with legal reporting obligations, encourages the victim or victim's family to report the abuse to civil authorities, and helps connect victims with professionals who can provide counselling assistance. The church indicated it has published numerous online resources to help lay leaders, members, victims, and their families, and that it will study and implement review recommendations for churches from the Abuse in Care Royal Commission of Inquiry."
I'm an ex-Mormon, and I'm going to talk about some of the thoughts and feelings I had going through a Mormon temple endowment ceremony for the first time. I am going to show some pictures.
Joseph Smith had over 30 wives. 7 of those girls were under 18 when he married them.
I then left the Mormon church, and that is a whole story that I
Young Mormons, usually like teenage to college student kind of age, are very sexually repressed.
Go on TikTok or YouTube or Reddit or any number of other social media sites and, man, there really is a lot of Mormon content out there.
The secret handshakes. It was like if a 9-year-old had invented a religion.
Sometimes it's someone talking about some entertainingly quirky aspect of Mormon life.
Have y'all heard of something called soaking?
To wear special religious underwear.
So you've never heard about the rock in the hat? For goodness sake, what are we talking about here?
These are all real things, by the way. The rock in a hat was the special stone Joseph Smith apparently used to translate the Book of Mormon. Caroline has already talked about the special underwear she received during her temple endowment ceremony. And soaking. You know, if you really want to know what soaking is, you can Google it.
Yeah, Mormons have got workarounds.
And of course, talking of workarounds, there's the trashy hit reality show Secret Lives of Mormon Wives.
We were raised to be these housewives for the men, serving their every desire.
The cast of which shot to fame after their admission to soft swinging.
No one was innocent. Everyone has hooked up with everyone.
But a lot of the online conversations about Mormonism have a much more serious purpose.
And somehow the victim just gets shamed and blamed and shunned and...
This is a clip from the Mormon Stories podcast. The woman speaking, Chelsea Goodrich, alleges that she was sexually assaulted by her father, who was a bishop. She was later offered a secret $300,000 by the church not to sue them. We discussed the case briefly in episode 4.
When I think of my choice to run a TikTok account dedicated to criticizing the church, I have to ask the question, who does my silence benefit? I've never met an ex-Mormon who's not elated to be free from the church.
That was Alyssa Grenfell, a Utah woman who grew up in the church but left in her mid-20s. She presents an honest but light-hearted look at Mormonism. Her TikTok tagline is, "I gave up eternal life for coffee."
Over the years, I've made
And then there's this ex-Mormon influencer.
One of the most startling aspects of the LDS cultural enterprise is the assumption that what's good for the church in Utah must be good for everyone else.
You might recognise that voice.
No mai haramai, welcome to a Thoughtful Faith podcast. I'm your host, Gina Colvin.
That's right, it's Gina, the Mormon expert who's popped up occasionally through this podcast. Gina is a significant voice in the international ex-Mormon community. She blogged under the name Kiwi Mormon, and later she hosted a podcast where she talks with guests about her many ethical and spiritual questions around the church. It's had millions of downloads. The point, though, is that whether it's jokes about unusual undergarments and soaking, or brainy conversations about cultural neo-colonialism, for the LDS Church, the internet has totally changed the game. An organisation that for almost 2 centuries managed to control what its members read and heard and therefore believed, has been confronted with this worldwide free-for-all of information. This internet information avalanche has sparked something that even the church is calling a faith crisis. Back in 2013, a huge report prepared for the church's top leadership tracked the spike in people quitting the church and directly correlated it to the growing speed of internet access. That report, without a hint of sarcasm, defined the faith crisis of individual Mormons as being a state of intense emotional and spiritual distress resulting from the discovery of church history facts that do not align with the traditional LDS narrative. History facts that do not align. Some might say that's a particularly polite way of admitting that maybe the church hasn't been telling the truth to its members. But in fairness to the church, around that time, they did start making efforts to talk more openly about the subjects members were stumbling across online. They began publishing a series of gospel topics essays, which pushed back on some points and just conceded on others. Things like the fact that DNA evidence totally contradicts the Book of Mormon, or that Joseph Smith really was a polygamist. Naturally, the people I've met while making this podcast haven't been immune to this faith crisis, but there's something I've found really curious. This podcast, Heaven's Helpline, has been focused on one particular and egregious failure of the LDS Church, the way that victims of sexual and domestic violence have been silenced or ignored, while offenders have been protected from legal consequences, and sometimes even elevated within the church. But for many of the people I've talked to, literal eyewitnesses to abuse and abuse cover-ups, that wasn't necessarily the thing that finally undermined their religious conviction. Faith is a powerful force, and sometimes you'd be surprised by what will and what won't break it. So, for the first part of this final episode, we're going to dig into that a little bit and find out from some of the people we've already met what happened to their faith in the LDS Church.
If Jesus had $100 billion, what would he spend it on?
I remember opening the door thinking, fuck, he knows. He knows.
I walked out of the temple that day, in my heart knowing I wouldn't go back.
I'm Murray Jones, and this is the final episode of Heaven's Helpline, a New Zealand Herald investigation into the Mormon Church in Aotearoa and beyond. Episode 6, Breaking the Shelf.
An egg on toast and a peppermint tea and a bundle of nerves.
Remember Caroline? We heard her story in the second episode, and when we left her, she'd escaped her abusive husband in Australia, returned to Auckland with the help of another Kiwi, John Campbell, then had that awful experience where church leaders pressured her into sitting down with her abuser.
And I said that I forgave him so that the meeting could be over and so that I could leave.
That experience was extremely re-traumatizing for Caroline, and she lost some trust in those specific leaders. But she didn't exactly blame it on the church.
Because we are taught that we need to forgive all people. As usual, I thought I was the one with the problem.
She stayed in the church for years after that. Sadly, there were more tough times to come for Caroline, including an abusive marriage with a second man she met through the church, though it was far less extreme this time round. And always, just like in her teenage years, Caroline had questions about the church's teachings.
I had a lot of doubts.
Some were quite specific, like why did Prophet Brigham Young ban black people from taking the priesthood? And why did the ban last all the way until 1978? And, a biggie, had the early Mormons really been polygamous, as outsiders kept claiming? Because that's not what she was hearing in church.
We had been taught that Joseph Smith did not have multiple wives.
Mostly, she brushed these doubts aside.
We're encouraged to not look into anything unless it's from the church source. So if ever I heard anything negative about the church from another source, I would ignore it.
Until, that is, 2013. Remember, 2013 was the year of that big internal report about a global faith crisis, and 2013 was the year the church started publishing those gospel topics essays.
These essays were on the official church website.
Which meant it was fine for Caroline to read them. And some of the subjects covered
were significant to me because they addressed issues that I had with the church.
Caroline was shocked to learn that actually the founder of the LDS faith, Joseph Smith, did have multiple wives.
The church admitted in these essays that yes, he did.
In another essay called Race and the Priesthood, about the early ban on black priests,
they admitted in that essay that basically it was just racism. It wasn't because God had cursed all these men for something that had happened in their lineage, in their ancestry.
Caroline found it hard to process what she was learning.
I read them over and over and over again.
And then, all of a sudden, Caroline's entire Mormon faith just fell apart.
Like, oh my God, I don't think this is true anymore.
Actually following that up and leaving the church wasn't easy though. After a lifetime of being guided by her scripture and church leaders, Caroline's decisions were now her own to make, which was liberating, but also scary.
It's like suddenly becoming an adult from being a child.
But with her faith gone, there was no going back. This experience Caroline had, a lifelong accumulation of doubts and questions, then a sudden collapse of faith at a particular moment in time. This is such a common experience amongst LDS leavers that they have a name for it. They call it breaking the shelf.
All of these things on my shelf, it got to be so heavy that
Things that should have broken my shelf, part 2.
It was more of a shelf item than it was an answer.
What was the moment that your shelf...
My shelf broke.
Why a shelf? Well, the shelf is the place where you stack up all of your doubts and questions, all the cognitive dissonances, with the intention of someday going back and figuring them out. But one day, you're carefully balancing just one more tricky question or inconvenient fact on the top of the pile, and the whole shelf breaks. And everything that's been piling up for years crashes to the floor. And you've got to deal with all of it, then and there.
We have so many things on our shelf as Mormons that we just park.
For Marlin, remember, he's the guy who mastered the art of the strategic pause when saving souls as a missionary. For Marlin, there was a lot of stuff stacked up on his shelf. He'd become really skeptical about those powers that senior church leaders were supposed to possess. Inspiration, where the Holy Spirit guides your decisions, and the power of discernment, where the Holy Ghost helps you distinguish truth from lies and good from evil. Like the time well after his mission, when Marlin's marriage was in trouble and he was having an affair. He knew it was wrong, he felt guilty, and every time he bumped into a leader with the power of discernment, he felt certain that they could look right into his heart and see the corruption there.
I'm having this affair, I'm being dishonest to the church, to God, to my wife. Get a knock at the door, it's the stake president, the top leader in that part of Auckland. I remember opening the door thinking, fuck, he knows, right? That's why he's knocking on my door. He goes, can I see you and your wife? Yeah, come in.
The stake president comes in, they sit down, and he tells Marlin the good news. The Lord has called him to be the ward's elders quorum leader. Quite an elevated position.
Those are his exact words. We know you are worthy because your name came up. I'm sitting on the couch next to my wife going, are you fucking kidding me? Here I was thinking he was going to say, because he's an inspired leader, we know what you've been doing. You've been naughty boy. But he didn't. And I'm thinking, holy shit. So what do? I double down. I accept. That's when I was starting to unravel. So that's when I was starting to get, these guys aren't inspired. This is bullshit.
Bullshit, maybe. But for now, Marlin just puts it on the shelf. Adds it to his fine collection of cognitive dissonances, things that just don't add up. And it's not until years later that Marlin's shelf breaks. He hears someone on the radio talking about Joseph Smith's polygamy, and he's thinking, it's just the usual anti-Mormon lies.
But he gave references, and then he said, go to the church's own family history site, go and have a look at the records.
Marlin went online and, sure enough,
I couldn't believe what I was finding. So I felt lied to, and I thought, if they're lying about that, what else are they lying? Then I went and investigated everything I could about the church. Within a week, I figured it was not what it claimed to be. Within 24 hours, I was like, holy moly.
It was that quick?
Yeah, it was that quick. Within 24 hours, I was like, I've been duped. This is a cult.
Everyone's journey out of the faith is different, but again and again I heard about a shelf-breaking moment. Quintin, the bishop we met in episode 3, his shelf was piled high with concerns, like the practice of tithing and what the church was actually doing with its extraordinary wealth.
If Jesus had $100 billion, what would he spend it on? He would clothe the naked, he would feed the hungry, he'd liberate the captive, he'd administer relief to the sick and the afflicted.
But the church, with its hundreds of billions, didn't seem to be doing very much of that at all. Also on Quintin's shelf, polygamy, the black priests issue, homophobic policies, and...
the church started to release some academic essays.
Those essays again. And look, Quintin really wanted to believe. He wanted to make it work. There was so much he loved about being a member of the church, but he just couldn't ignore this new information. So he sought reassurance. One day in 2017, at a Sunday open forum discussion, Quintin asked a question about the life of Joseph Smith.
I said, what about the other versions of this story? And there was a bit of a chuckle from the teacher. He says, yeah, but we won't talk about that today. And that was it. And I actually left the class, stood in the hallway. I was 39 or 40 at the time. I just started crying. I broke down and I just cried, and I realised that I wasn't going to get answers. And too many things have been piled up on top of each other.
Actually, rather than a shelf breaking, Quintin has a way of describing it that I like even more. Because where else but in New Zealand would you get this metaphor for the sudden, catastrophic collapse of your faith in your church?
Like a jar of Jaffas or a bag of lollies at the movie theatre, and it breaks open, all scattered down under the seats and down the stairs, and there's the rattling and going everywhere, and you just know you're not going to get all your lollies back. That's how I felt. I could never pick them all up. It was not going to work. That was it. And I left the building. I went home, and I haven't been to a service since.
For Gayleen, she of the white cake and the handful of dirt, it was a book that did it. In 2018, the church published a popular history called Saints. It was part of that same wave of openness triggered by the global faith crisis. And just like in the essays, the book concedes that Joseph Smith was a polygamist. And actually, he married a 14-year-old behind his first wife's back.
I was shocked. I couldn't put it together with all the doctrine.
For the first time in her life, Gayleen started looking at her faith with a critical eye.
I just wanted to know what was true.
It was tough going.
Emptiness, confusion.
She made repeated visits to the temple in search of solace and inspiration. But finally, a couple of years after first picking up that history book, she was done.
I walked out of the temple that day, kind of in my heart knowing I wouldn't go back.
And then there's the leaving story of the person who's probably New Zealand's most famous ex-Mormon ever. Former Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern. Ardern declined my request for an interview for this podcast, but she's talked before about why she left the LDS Church in her early 20s. This is from a 2017 interview with New Zealand personality Anika Moa.
Heavily in politics. I was involved in campaigning for civil unions. And one of the things where I really departed from the church was on their views around homosexuality. And, you know, it was a bit of a contradiction that here I was campaigning for this thing over here, and, you know, I was in a church that hadn't quite embraced diversity. And I used to
Ganesh, the other ex-bishop we met in episode 3, he had a faith crisis too, triggered again by those infamous essays. But even today, he still goes to church on Sundays. He still sees the community's potential for good, even if he no longer believes all the doctrine. As it happens, Ganesh knew Jacinda Ardern long before she shot to fame in the Labour Party, and he says Ardern's impressive career has been a challenge for some Mormons.
It's a real conflict for members of the church in New Zealand of what you do with Jacinda Ardern, because she's obviously left the church and she's extremely productive and amazing, but that's not the narrative that we have. We have the narrative of people leave and they're less than.
In 2019, Prime Minister Ardern briefly met the LDS Global President, Russell Nelson, when he visited New Zealand. It was arranged by her uncle Ian Ardern, who was the most senior church leader for the Pacific region. And I think you can hear in this clip that President Nelson was having trouble getting his head around the post-Mormon achievements of young Jacinda.
It's an unlikely scenario, a young mother leading a great nation. We're very impressed with her. She'll have a great future.
But even grudging praise is more than most ex-Mormons get when they leave the church. It can mean the end of important lifelong relationships and networks. Marlin says when he told his parents he'd stopped believing,
they just ignored me, shut me off, and then told my friends that I was an anti-Mormon, that I was Antichrist.
It can mean falling out of sync with people you thought you were close to. Here's Quentin.
Those relationships were not the types of relationships I thought they were. There's a term that's used in the church a lot about unconditional love, and I didn't feel it. Like I felt it was extremely conditional. Like as soon as I decided not to believe, that love was turned off.
And there's that leaving narrative Ganesh mentioned, that if you go, your life will fall apart. When I interviewed Quentin, I also met his wife, Sarah, who quit the church around the same time as him. She said leaving was scary because for years she'd been told,
your life is going to fall apart, your children will run off and literally become criminals and they'll lose all moral compass, all that sort of thing.
She's really not exaggerating. This message comes right from the top.
You want to walk away from the church? Walk away from anything that lets anything in your life count.
This is Brad Wilcox, a Brigham Young University lecturer and senior youth leader, choking up with emotion when speaking at a Mormon youth gathering in Utah a couple of years ago.
I hope you realize that if you walk away from this religion, you lose everything.
So, this LDS faith crisis has been simmering away inside the church for more than a decade. But meanwhile, beyond the world of its believers, the church has been fighting other fires. In recent years, there have been scandals about the church's investments.
The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and its investment arm will pay a fine totaling $5 million.
And how it spends tithes.
They'd been led to believe would be spent on humanitarian aid and other charitable causes. Now, instead, they're accusing the church of investing the money.
There's been public pushback at the church's attitude to gay people.
Director insisted the faith does not support conversion therapy, but
an outrage about sexual abuse inside the Boy Scouts, which in the US has especially close ties to the LDS Church.
The LDS Church has been hit with several lawsuits for allegedly covering up decades of sexual abuse among Boy Scout troops.
And of course, there has been a huge reaction to the kind of abuse and abuse cover-ups that we focused on in this podcast, including those two big Associated Press stories about the helpline in the US.
An abuse helpline used by lay leaders was used to cover up Latter-day Saints tried to pay.
We're going to look at how the church is reacting to these scandals, these threats to its money and reputation. But first, I want you to hear just one more leaving story. Neville Rocco was that high-flying Australian lawyer and high-flying Mormon who got caught up in the internal church court process after a young missionary complained that he'd been raped by his mission companion. You'll remember from episode 3 that it got complicated. Neville concluded the complaint was legit, but when it seemed the offender would get away with a slap on the wrist from the church, Neville helped the victim take the case to police. But getting so deeply involved in this case, sitting with the victim as he told his story to police, learning in those interviews about additional rapes, all this sparked a trauma response in Neville himself.
Because I was emoting on
behalf of this victim. I myself took it on. I was diagnosed with PTSD, and the advice was you must stay away from all potential triggers.
Staying away from triggers meant a break from going to church.
I think that was very good advice. I was able to recover as a result of that. But it's during that time that I decided I'd take a good look at the church. I thought, well, I've had lots of questions for years and years. I haven't really had a chance to check those things out. So I'm going to do that.
And I think you can guess what happened next. With all that time on his hands, Neville dug into those gospel topics essays and started thinking more deeply about LDS doctrine and truth claims.
And that led to my leaving the church overall.
Since leaving, Neville's also had time to think about how the church handles complaints about abuse. And he's been thinking about what it would take to make things better. The fact is, the LDS Church has reformed itself more than a few times. It abandoned polygamy. It reversed the ban on black priests. Its stance on homosexuality, though still pretty hostile, is less hostile than it was. Publishing the Gospel Topics essays was essentially a reversal of a policy of suppressing the Church's true history. In 2020, the church in New Zealand created a Te Reo Māori speaking branch in Kaikohe, Northland, the first one for 70 years after Te Reo was banned in the church in the 1950s. Some of these changes were a matter of adapt or die. The church leaders' revelation that it was time to pivot away from polygamy in 1890 came at a time when the US federal government was passing increasingly harsh laws against the practice. But change can also come from within, like what happened to worthiness interviews in 2018. So remember, worthiness interviews are those one-on-one meetings where members have a chat with their bishop, which means teenagers are being routinely asked whether they're having sexual thoughts or have ever masturbated. Remember too that Quintin, the former bishop, thought they were pretty problematic.
You know, I'm an old man talking to these young teens in the privacy of my office. That, on reflection, is so gross.
Well, around 2017, a Utah Mormon in his mid-60s, a former bishop called Sam Young, also decided that it was so gross. He'd learned that bishops often asked really explicit questions.
I've got 6 daughters. I asked one of them, did this happen to you? And she said, yeah, Dad, when I was 12, the bishop asked me, do you masturbate? I tell you, I still get a little anger in me to think this happened to my child behind a closed door.
So he started a campaign to reform the worthiness interviews. On a website Young set up, hundreds of women shared their experiences, ranging from the uncomfortable to the traumatic. They've been asked questions like, describe the sexual positions you engaged in, or what were you thinking of while you masturbated, or how many fingers did you use? And Sam Young's campaign worked. The rules were changed. Nowadays, a child can have another adult, such as a parent, in the room with them. Teens are still asked if they're following the law of chastity, but the opportunity for the bishop to be a creepy old man is somewhat reduced. But there's a twist. The policy changed, but Sam Young was excommunicated. And Neville Rocco says that's not surprising. That's just the way things roll in the Mormon Church.
Is it reformable? Yes, but somebody's going to have to put their head above the parapet. They'll get shot. They will get shot. And then what they'll do is they'll pick over their cadavers and pick a few reforms that they'll take out of that to make it look like they are listening. They only listen by shooting first and asking questions later.
There are other examples of this pattern. In 2004, Simon Southerton, an Australian Mormon and a geneticist, published a book explaining how DNA evidence contradicted church dogma. He was excommunicated, but a decade later, the church conceded that very thing in one of those gospel topic essays. Further back, in September 1993, 6 quite senior members of the church were kicked out at once because they'd been calling for various reforms. Greater transparency about church history, more leadership positions for women, greater tolerance for gay church members. 30 years on, critics would say there's still a long way to go, but there has, without question, been some reform, at least in all of those areas. And sometimes a campaign for change succeeds, and you don't even get kicked out.
There's been times throughout the campaign when Jane and I thought we'd get excommunicated, and have been quite surprised on many occasions when it hasn't happened.
This is Sarah Delaney. She's from Redditch in Worcestershire. That's about half an hour south of Birmingham in the UK. She's been in the church for 47 years, since joining at the age of 20 with her husband and 2 small children. Sarah has worked as a probation officer and social worker and has spent more than 30 years working with sexual offenders and abuse victims. So she knows a lot about what it takes to reduce risks to children. And she could see that there were serious problems with the way the LDS Church viewed abuse.
We have a culture that really does allow abuse to flourish. We know the only thing necessary for sexual abuse to flourish is secrecy. And in the church, we don't talk about it, which makes it much easier to hide.
From her professional life, Sarah knew that there was one particularly effective tool for reducing risks to children: routine criminal background checks on people who work with children and vulnerable adults. In the UK, it's called a DBS. She talked to her local leaders about doing this in the church, and she got nowhere.
Every attempt to have conversations with leaders was shut down very quickly. It was like, yeah, the priesthood are dealing with this, we've got it, there's nothing for you to be concerned about. And I just couldn't break through anybody listening and paying attention to the seriousness of the problems.
So in 2021, she and another LDS member, Jane Christie, launched a formal campaign, which became known as 21st Century Saints.
I just randomly started asking bishops and leaders, if you were concerned about sexual abuse or any form of abuse of a child, what would you do? Who would you report it to? And apart from phoning the church helpline, not one person could tell me.
Yep, just like in the US and in New Zealand, the UK church has an abuse helpline.
And so that kind of raised alarms that they didn't know what to do if there was an allegation of abuse.
And what was happening when bishops reached out to the helpline?
They've been advised by the church legal services and helpline not to make a statement and not to be involved in investigations, which is deeply alarming.
Sarah and Jane got to work. They wrote to MPs. They launched a podcast.
YouTube shorts, TikToks, just anything that was getting people talking, really. I remember walking around my chapel one Sunday morning and filming the first aid station, the eye wash station, the fire extinguishers, the health and safety book, the rodent control traps, and kind of put a video on YouTube and said, hey, we've got all this stuff in our chapel and nothing about child abuse.
They also wrote a letter to every bishop in the country, telling them that they should be using the DBS background checks. The letter said the church was letting victims down. It said the church was leaving abusers unsupervised and unsafe. And, crucially, the letter informed bishops that they could be personally, legally responsible if they appointed someone who went on to abuse a child and they hadn't conducted a DBS.
It was very effective because we actually even had bishops' wives contacting us and say, you're telling me my husband's responsible for this? So that got quite a reaction, and we heard of stake presidents that were forced to gather all their bishops together and discuss it. The church lawyers got very angry with us. They got ever so angry, never so upset with us, and wrote quite a strong-worded letter to us about our actions, telling us that we couldn't write to bishops. I thought, well, write to anyone I like, actually.
Meanwhile, Sarah and Jane were getting messages from all over the UK, from people with stories of mishandled abuse cases. They started collecting them, 140 in total, which is a pretty interesting number, because just 2 years earlier, the church had come up with its own number. It told a 2019 inquiry into child sexual abuse in the UK that it was aware of just 16 recorded allegations of abuse within the church over the past decade. 16? To Sarah, that figure was absurd.
So is it simply that the church are only counting those cases where there's been a conviction? Because their figure is 16 in 10 years. Jane and I know of more than that. 16 in 10 years. We can point them to that many easily.
But even while the church was seeming to deny it had an abuse problem, Sarah and Jane's TikToks and podcasts, random questions to bishops, and I think probably most importantly, that letter warning bishops about their own legal peril, it had an impact. In June 2023, the UK LDS Church suddenly announced mandatory background checks for anyone working with children or vulnerable adults.
And that was fantastic. There's nothing in legislation that said they had to do it. The church voluntarily decided that all the evidence and all the information they had showed that that was the right way to go, and they did it. Fantastic start, guys. But now we need DBS for missionaries. We need a far better, more enhanced training programme. We need to move forward.
Like Sarah says, the UK Church deciding to use background checks, that's a fantastic result. But it does beg the question, right? If it's good enough for the UK, why isn't it church policy everywhere? This is an incredibly centralised organisation. Each Sunday, millions of church members in over 100 countries hear a sermon on the same topic. Every teen gets exactly the same messages in seminary school. Every person going through the endowment ceremony watches the same video. There's a handbook of instructions, and the same rules and procedures apply to Mormon leaders all over the world. If anyone can roll out a policy worldwide, it's the LDS Church. But in New Zealand, for example, the church still isn't doing background checks, and there are no laws here requiring them to do so. It's just one of the ways that our legal system makes it possible for the church to do the things we've learnt about in this podcast. Things like not reporting abuse, and dealing with predators in-house, and pressuring bishops into silence via the helpline, all without even breaking the law. Here are some of the other gaps in New Zealand law that make all this possible. Firstly, we have no laws requiring mandatory reporting. This is the idea that people in certain positions of responsibility who learn of abuse are obliged to report it to the authorities. In many jurisdictions, teachers, carers, doctors, and sometimes clergy, if they learn of any child abuse, they are legally required to report it to the authorities. In New Zealand, they're not. Secondly, priest-penitent privilege is a thing here. Remember, priest-penitent privilege, PPP, is what keeps a confession confidential. Not every country has laws recognising PPP, but New Zealand does. It's all there in Section 58 of the Evidence Act 2006. It's one of the most strongly written versions of PPP in law anywhere in the world. Thirdly, in civil court, we have a short statute of limitations for historic abuse. If you want to take a civil case against an organisation where you were sexually abused, well, New Zealand has a 6-year limitation date, which is kind of crazy when you consider that there's solid research to show that it takes survivors of child abuse around 25 years on average before they're ready to report what happened to them. So, New Zealand could make some big strides just by changing the law. After all, we know from stories of the abuse helpline, both here and overseas, that the Mormon Church keeps a very close eye on what's legal and what's not. But laws don't change overnight. What could change, and honestly, it could really be quite fast if the will were there, is the church's own policies. Some of the people I've talked to for this podcast have really clear ideas of some in-house changes the church could make that really would make a difference. Anahira Herbert Graves said the church could simply make reporting mandatory without waiting to be told.
For there to be systemic change, and that's what is needed, our general authorities, which covers the whole world, they need to mandate very clearly to all of our leaders any allegation must first and foremost be taken to the police. It's a crime. The church can deal with the sin aspect of it, but not in lieu of.
Anahira has another suggestion, by the way, which is also pretty hard to argue with.
I really do want to see more and more notice taken of women leaders in the church. I don't see why we have to ask permission to blow the whistle, to speak out about these things publicly. You know, these are crimes.
Neville Rocco has an idea too. The church could teach its bishops a different playbook for when they hear a shocking confession, even in places where priest-penitent privilege applies.
If I were a bishop in the Mormon church and somebody came to me and said, look, I've been abusing children, or I've raped a person, or I've killed somebody, I'd say, well, what you've told me is covered by a confidentiality, at least within the church. But if you're truly penitent, you will come with me to the police and repeat the same thing as a confessor to the police. If you won't do that, then I can't accept that you're truly penitent, and therefore I should be free to go to the police myself. So that's the way I would solve it.
See? With a bit of imagination, you can find ways to do the right thing. And on that third law, the statute of limitations, there's one new voice I'd like you to hear from. Now, remember that back in episode 3, we heard that awful story of Jenny, who said that in the 1960s she was abused by an adult church member and then abused again by her bishop when she reported it to him. Like I said, Jenny's now trying to sue the church, and her lawyer in this case is Mobina Hills.
I've been working with abuse survivors for about 13 years now.
And one of the issues Mobina had to explain to Jenny was that New Zealand had this surprisingly short statute of limitations when it comes to civil law. For many of Mobina's cases, the church involved has chosen not to use that statute of limitations defence, even though it's available to them. But with Jenny's case, with the Mormon church in the gun, it's been a totally different story. Mobina says the LDS Church has stuck to the letter of the law on the statute of limitations and has generally been far more aggressive in their language and tactics than other religious institutions she's dealt with.
To the point where it's been re-traumatizing to our clients, which is most unusual. In many cases, churches and institutions are survivor-focused and would seek to accept the allegations that the survivor has put to the church. In this particular case, we haven't seen that at all. The church has been utterly dismissive and really relying on the legal basis to really defend the claim and not seeing Jenny as a person at all.
So look, the world could hold out for the LDS Church to switch to mandatory reporting without waiting for a law change, like Anahira just suggested. We could wait to see if the LDS Church will advise its bishops to set aside the protective shield of priest-penitent privilege, as Neville recommends. But it seems much more likely that the Church will instead continue to take the kind of aggressive, legalistic approaches that Mobina talks about. There have been examples all over the world. In its submission to the UK's child abuse inquiry, the LDS Church opposed the introduction of mandatory reporting laws. In the US, the church is still leaning heavily on PPP. Late last year, I saw there was a depressing update to the case of Paul Adams' daughters. Remember, they were suing the church because Mormon officials had known that Paul Adams was abusing them and did nothing to stop him for 7 years. Well, in the end, the daughter's case was dismissed.
An Arizona judge has dismissed a high-profile child sex abuse lawsuit. Superior Court judge said the state's clergy penitent privilege excused 2 bishops from the state's child sex abuse mandatory reporting law.
The church lawyers successfully argued that because Paul Adams had admitted to the abuse during confession, those 2 bishops, Herod and Morsey, who'd called the abuse helpline and been advised how to proceed, had no legal duty to let authorities know about the child rapist in their midst, nor the dozen or so other Mormon officials that were made aware of his crimes during his church disciplinary council. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints had won. There's a hymn that the Mormon Tabernacle Choir is especially famous for, called Come, Come, Ye Saints. It's a song composed in 1846, just 16 years after the foundation of Joseph Smith's new religion. This was a time when the members were being driven ever further west, from New York to Ohio, from Ohio to Missouri, from Missouri up to Illinois, then eventually all the way to Salt Lake Valley, Utah. The song celebrates the faith and the perseverance of the Mormon pioneers and their determination to strive onwards despite persecution and hardship. Gird up your loins, says the second verse, and fresh courage take. 180 years later, the church has an investment portfolio worth $260 billion US. It's easily one of the richest churches in the world. It's not exactly the underdog anymore. Yet Come, Come Ye Saints is still the musical centerpiece of major Mormon gatherings. There are still echoes deep in the church's memory of being outsiders, of being persecuted, of having to stand up for themselves and forge on regardless. So, despite its battles with financial regulators, with lawyers like Tim Kosnoff, with a faith crisis in its ranks, the church is currently in an era of massive expansion, building temples all over the world. Since President Russell M. Nelson took over as the church's leader in 2018, he's announced at least 130 new temple builds, including in India, Guatemala, and of course, New Zealand.
Now you've been wondering a little bit about, is Brother Nelson going to say anything about our temple?
This is him in 2019 speaking to 12,000 Mormons in Auckland.
Today I'm pleased to announce that the new temple will be built in Auckland on Redoubt Road.
One new temple, planned for the outskirts of Las Vegas, was meant to have a spire 66 meters high, but designers shaved off 6 meters at the last minute because otherwise they'd have had to put a flashing beacon on the top for the safety of passing planes. More temples doesn't necessarily mean more members, at least in the US, where growth seems to have stagnated. But according to the church, membership is growing rapidly in Africa.
The groundbreaking for the Kinshasa Democratic Republic of the Congo Temple is the most recent example of the steady and impressive rise of the church in this exotic land.
When President Nelson was in Nairobi in 2018, he told his audience, poor people could only break out of the generational cycles of poverty when they pay their tithing. So, overall, the church's numbers are still growing. The most recent official church count put membership at 17.3 million people. People might be leaving because of the church's attitude to LGBT rights or the practice of tithing or the cover-up of abuse or because of some information they found in a gospel topics essay online or even on a TikTok. But new people are still joining. There are still enthusiastic missionaries pounding the pavements worldwide. A couple of years ago, just after I'd finished my Business Desk series of articles about the church's finances, there was an open day at Temple View. I went along, more out of nosiness than anything else. It was a rare chance for outsiders to get a glimpse of the inside of the Mormon experience. Back then, I was fixated on Mormon money. I was looking around at all the marble and gold, thinking about the tithing and what it had cost the members, the sacrifices made to grant this grand monument to the Mormon faith. About the same time, in South Auckland, in one of the poorest areas in the country, you could see the beginnings of New Zealand's second Mormon temple in Manukau. Every time I drive back to Auckland, I see it getting bigger and bigger, and it's nearly done. And yeah, At the beginning, as the scaffolding went up and the body of the temple began to fill out, I was thinking about money, tithes, wealth, poverty, a charity that never seems to spend much of its wealth on helping the homeless or feeding the hungry. But over the past 2 years, the towering Auckland Temple has come to represent something quite different for me. I see it and I think about the worthiness tests, the power of the priesthood holders. I think about the way those structures have allowed those abuses to flourish in the church, and how so much of that power revolves around the temple and whether you are good enough to enter it. And I think about Caroline, who 30 years ago sat on a hill next to the temple in Hamilton. She'd just finished her endowment ceremony, so she could go ahead with the marriage that would become a living nightmare. She sat there and thought about the curious rituals she had just gone through and asked herself, what the hell is this? Do I really believe in this? Socially isolated, yet surrounded by fellow churchgoers, she had no one to validate her feelings. No one to tell her to trust her instincts. And so, thinking the problem lay with her, she didn't trust her own judgment. She deferred to her male authority figures. Now though, the internet is letting the light in. People are sharing TikToks about temple rituals and YouTube essays about what Joseph Smith really got up to. But perhaps most importantly, they are sharing experiences about what has gone wrong in the past. They're hearing from people like Caroline, who have stories to tell.
I think the church behaves a lot like an abuser in encouraging guilt and gaslighting you, in saying, no, that's not actually happening. It's you're the one with the problem. You don't have enough faith.
During that final interview with Caroline, I asked her, if you were talking to a Mormon girl right now, to a teenage girl, what would you say to her? What advice would you give her?
What would I tell them? There's so much that I could tell them. I would tell them that if they're not comfortable with something, to listen to that and to trust themselves. The church will say that if you study something out in your mind and you pray about it and you feel confusion, then it's not of God. I would say to them, other people are feeling confused too. Other people are not comfortable either. They're hiding it because it's not socially acceptable to admit it. So I would say explore that confusion. And I would say trust in your own intelligence. God gave you a brain. God gave you a mind. I don't believe in God anymore, but if you still believe in God, why did he give you this thinking intelligence to reason and work things out if you weren't allowed to think for yourself, if you weren't allowed to make decisions for yourself without passing it through a priesthood leader first? So every major life decision, it's your decision. No one else has a right to make those decisions for you.
Heaven's Helpline was funded by New Zealand On Air and the New Zealand Herald for NZME and iHeartRadio. It was researched, written and presented by me, Murray Jones. My producers were Adam Dudding, who co-wrote the series, and Kirsten Johnston from Popsock Media, who edited and sound designed it. Phil Brownlee is our sound engineer. Music was by Thomas Arbour and Anita Clark. Ethan Sills is executive producer here at New Zealand Herald. An additional interview was by Helen King. We had scripting advice from Melody Thomas and Andrew Laxon. Artwork was done by Phil Johnson. News clippings came from Fox News 13 Utah, 12 News NBC, and ABC4 Utah. Special thanks to Victoria Young, Matt Martell, Maggie Dudding, Christina Greentree, and Allegra Scales, and all the voice actors who pitched in. Ngā mihi nui to all those who spoke to me for this podcast. I know it wasn't easy for people to speak out. If you have a story you'd like to share with me about the LDS Church, or just want to get in touch, email me securely at murrayreports@proton.me, or DM me on X at murrayreports. And for more on this podcast, head to nzherald.co.nz/Heaven's Helpline. It's time intensive doing investigations like this. So if you value this kind of journalism, please support it by going to your podcast platform and rating and reviewing the series. If you've been impacted by any of the issues in this series, we have included details of support services in the show notes.